Hi, my name is Marla Neufeld. I'm a reproductive partner at the law firm of Greenspoon Martyr. And today I have such a wonderful guest. I have such a great opportunity to handle many matters with her. I have Deb Roberts from Embryo Connections. And today we're going to talk about the process of embryo donation and how Deb helps parents and donors alike match and create a family through the amazing process of embryo donation. So Deb, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to get to her presentation very soon. I just wanted to give a really brief overview of the Florida laws regarding embryo donation. So every state has different laws regarding this process. In Florida, embryo donation is handled just like egg or sperm donation. And essentially, the donor or the donors give up all legal rights to the donated embryos to the recipient, as long as that intent is expressed clearly within the parties' agreement. So as I said, every state handles this differently, but that was just a brief overview of Florida, where it is permissible to donate embryos in Florida, and it is not any form of adoption. So with that, Deb, I'd love to hear how you founded Embryo Connections, how you got into this area, and just hear a little bit more about your story with this.
Great. Thank you so much, Marla. It's so great to see you. We love working with you, and thank you for presenting this really important topic, because there's so much to learn about it. I think it's a pretty new space, and there's so many things that I think people are wondering about if this is right for them. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for being here.
So a little bit about my story. I'm actually a single mom by choice, and I had my children through embryo donation. It was a really long path for me. I think a lot of people, when they're going through IVF, feel it's a really long path for a lot of people, and they feel pretty alone in it because they don't feel like they have a lot of options. They just have to do. They realize that their dreams for parenthood are in the hands of a physician who may or may not be able to create children for them. I did a lot of rounds of IVF. It was a really daunting 4 years of my life, trying to figure out how I was going to have children, because I knew that I always wanted to be a mom. It was something that was in my path somehow, and I found myself older than I expected without a partner. So I decided that I needed to do the journey by myself. I went through IVF and I couldn't use my own eggs. My eggs were just too old. And I came to the end of the line, and I found that the embryo donation programs that were available to me just didn't meet my needs, or wouldn't accept me, frankly, as a recipient. So that was pretty devastating. And I went, my background is marketing. So I went out there and marketed myself, and I communicated to the world that I was looking for either an unwanted pregnancy or embryos. I just needed somebody who had leftover embryos that I could use, because I knew that my problem was my eggs. And if I could solve that problem, I would be able to have children. I was very fortunate in that I got a lot of response from my reach out. I actually just reached out on Facebook to my entire network, and I asked them to forward the message, and I got embryos. I got donors who came from all over the world. I had embryos that I could have had shipped from Bangkok because somebody had heard about my need. And it just goes to show how many donors are out there who would love to donate embryos to people. And they just didn't know how. Or they were told by their clinic maybe that it wasn't an option, whatever the reason. So when I finished my journey and I had my first child, so now I have 2 children, and they are both conceived from the same batch of embryos. So I have genetically related children. They're not related to me, but they're absolutely the most amazing kids I ever could have dreamed of, and frankly, way better than my genetics. So I feel just enormously grateful to my donor. And I feel grateful to my clinic, who was willing to take the risk, even though they hadn't done embryo donation before. I'm grateful to the donors who tried to donate to me but weren't able to, because it really opened my eyes to a need that I was able, because of my marketing background, and also because of my fortitude to get through a lot of big hurdles. I was able to have children. And I just realized how many people needed that. The clinics need it, the donors need it, and intended parents need it. There's so many people who needed something that would that would help them donate embryos or have children.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you
So
how many times people ask me, is this resource? Because once a parent or parents create their embryos, they're frozen for an indefinite amount of time, essentially. And there's associated storage costs, and the other options that might not be an option for everyone could be destroying them, donating to science. But if there's an ability to allow someone else to have a family, it's an incredible thing that you help facilitate.
yeah,
And
it is really amazing. And when we speak to donors, that's exactly what we hear. They say, I have two amazing children that I was fortunate enough to have because I went through IVF and I was successful. But it was a really painful journey. All people who go through IVF have empathy for anybody else going through IVF, because even those who are successful in their journey will note how painful it is. And so they really want to give that gift, and they also can't imagine, after all the work they did and after knowing how fabulous their kids are, to not let those embryos have a chance with somebody who really wants to have kids.
For sure. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about the process, demystify a little bit. How does it work for kind of on both sides? As a potential recipient of the embryo donors, what steps do you go through, and how does an embryo donor, get matched with the recipient? So I would love to hear how the process generally works with your agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to talk about how the process works for us. There are multiple agencies out there, or multiple organizations out there. We all work a little bit differently, so I can talk to how we work. Yeah. But I do encourage people to find a program that fits right for them. The picture that you're seeing right here is actually one of our clients. Who this was a picture that was taken 1 year after her transfer. So they're so excited to be parents, and just I was really impressed actually with the creativity of the embryo frame. So how do you have time for that when you've got a 3-month-old?
I saw something like that before and after picture.
Yes, exactly. So the process works pretty much the same for donors and recipients. I think both come in for different reasons, of course. When a donor comes in, we talked about that they're coming in because they have remaining embryos, and they really want to donate those to somebody who wants to be a parent. And everybody comes in as a recipient for different reasons, right? So if you're an intended parent, it might be because you did go through rounds of IVF and have no children. For some people, it's secondary infertility. Maybe they had children early in life, but they're remarried and they want to have children again. Some people are just married a little bit late or never found a partner like me, and they went to their physician, and their physician said they've got a 2% chance. My doctor gave me 2%, and I actually translated that to about -2%. My likelihood was pretty darn low, and as it turns out, I was right. So the chance of being successful is low for them, and they just say, we're not going to invest in that. We really don't care about our genetics. We were planning on traditional adoption anyway. Traditional adoption is really hard, and I think that's maybe underestimated for those who say to an intended parent, why don't you just adopt? It's probably maybe one of the worst things that somebody struggling to conceive can hear, because just adopting is actually pretty, it's a long road, expensive, and not always fruitful. So this is a great option for those who want to have a child, want to carry for themselves, want to experience pregnancy, and want to control that situation a little bit more, because once you have an embryo, once you have embryos and you transfer them and you're pregnant, that's your child, right? Right from the beginning, you control the in utero environment, and you have a baby at the end.
And just to mention as well that these embryos can be used for purposes of gestational surrogacy as well, provided it complies with the applicable laws and all the correct paperwork is handled as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There are a lot of people who will choose the GC route because they've they've exhausted their own attempts, and at this point they don't care about their own genetics. They really just want to have a child, and so we see all options. So a little bit about Embryo Connections is a great segue. Is that Embryo Connections is we're all inclusive. We're not faith-based, and so that means a few things. It means that we don't consider it adoption. We consider it embryo donation and human tissue donation. So we'll talk about those things. And it means that we accept all family types. So you can be married or single, LGBT, you can be using a GC. All of those are viable intended parents.
Because that can be a hurdle with the traditional adoption arena, where it might be more difficult for a single parent to adopt. So this really opens it up to all walks of life, which is amazing.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And the way that we think about it, we really have three premises. One of them is that anybody who wants to be a parent, we want them to be able to, right? So that's that we're all inclusive. But the second is that we want everybody to have freedom to choose. We want to empower both donors and recipients to feel really good about their donation. And what that means is that a donor and a recipient are going to tell us what their criteria is for the other family, right? You know, what is, whether it's physical characteristics or values or even geographic proximity. Everybody has things in their head about who they want to match with. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity to match with the right family. And so while we're all inclusive, we want a family to tell us exactly whom they'd like to match with. And some people say, we really just want a child to love, or we really just want a loving home. And those are fabulous. We love those matches because that's really, you know, it's really just a beautiful gift. But you're able to have criteria. The second thing that we believe, or the third thing we believe in rather, is making this as easy as possible. So we're going to talk about that in the process. When we talk about what the basics are, there are a few things that Embryo Connections is going to provide that maybe make it different than doing it on your own. So one is matching. We do all the matching ourselves. So we're going to ask everybody to complete a profile, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll match you. We're kind of a matchmaking service, right? We're going to find the people who meet criteria in a few ways. One is that you have mutually shared criteria. The second, which is here, is batches. We want families to have as many genetically related children as they want to have. So if they want to have siblings, we're going to donate in a batch that will allow them to not only have a sibling, but also have failed attempts. We know that not every embryo results in a live birth. Our statistics, our success rates are a lot higher than the industry standard because we have standards on the embryos that we're willing to receive. But we know that not everyone is going to result in a live birth. So we want people to have multiple chances.
Is there like an average number of embryos that a parent might receive in a particular match, or is it just vary?
It varies on a bunch of things. So it's going to vary, one, on how many kids they want to have. So we try to do about a 2-to-1 ratio. It's not always 2-to-1, but if you, and there are factors that are related to that. So for example, we have a lot of people who use an egg donor and then want to donate their embryos because they received a beautiful gift. They want to pass that along, right? They have, and maybe they PGS tested their embryos too. So we know that they're chromosomally normal embryos. Right. So that means you might get a smaller batch to still have your 2 kids. So maybe that's 3 embryos to have your 2 kids. We always donate in batches of 2 or more. So we're typically donating between 2 and 5 embryos. And if you want to have 3 kids, we're going to have to look for 5 embryos for you so that you can have a few chances for that. So we're going to donate in batches, and that means that if you're looking for 1 child, you maybe get 2 embryos so that you can have 2 tries. And the last thing we talked about was making it as easy as possible. So we're going to handle everything that we can. We're going to gather medical records from our donors so that we can share that with the receiving clinic so that they can approve the embryos. We're going to refer counselors to you and refer attorneys like you, Marla. We love to recommend Marla. She's fabulous. So we're going to recommend counselors and attorneys in your state that are familiar with third-party reproduction and and can really answer your questions in an informed way.
Great.
So we're going to walk through the entire journey, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. And so I guess next is the actual donation process. Is this just like from when a parent, an intended parent approaches you and says, I need donor embryos, kind of the steps that they go through in being matched?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing that we're going to do is connect you with a client care manager. And that client care manager is going to listen to your needs, answer any questions that you have, make sure that you're comfortable with the embryo donation process. And you'll complete a profile, and that profile is going to contain information that will help us match and help us do our job down the road. The donors are going to also complete a profile. They're going to sign a medical records release, and we're going to ask them to do FDA eligibility screening. So all donors need to qualify as a human tissue donor in order to donate their embryos. So that's a really important distinction between trying to do it on your own. It's something that we're able to facilitate is this FDA eligibility.
Yeah,
so we'll
realize they think that because the embryos have already been created, that there may be no medical screening required, but in fact, like you said, FDA does govern this and has certain protocol because it is the handling of human tissue. So it's
right, yes, it's interesting because the embryos are actually human tissue, right? They're akin to donating a liver or a kidney or a heart. Mm-hmm. And so there are guidelines that we have to follow to ensure that we're meeting FDA regulations.
For sure.
So it's a pretty easy process though. So donors, don't beware. We're not going to request a lot from you. And again, we try to make the process as easy as possible. So we can even send a mobile phlebotomy unit to their house so that they can run the labs right from their home. We do try to make it easy. And the last thing that we do in that early get started stage is ask all intended parents to do a criminal background check. It's really simple. It's not a home study. We don't require a home study because this is not adoption, but we feel like that's important for all donors that we've completed that step.
Okay.
And then we match, and this is the exciting part. It takes about 3 to 7 months for us to find a match. Sometimes it can be a lot faster,
right.
And we'll talk about how that can happen. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but we match everybody. We can match all donors and all recipients as long as they're meeting our basic criteria.
Okay, great.
So we're going to match them. Well, the way that's going to work is that we're going to send a complete profile to a recipient so that they can approve that donor. They say, yes, that feels like a good fit to me. And then the donor is going to approve the recipient profile so that they can say, yep, this feels like a good fit to me too. If it's an open interaction, we'll ask the donors and the recipients to meet. They'll do a Zoom call, just like we're doing right now. They'll get to know each other for about 30 minutes. It's kind of a speed date. Everybody says, yes, we feel great about moving forward. And then we send an embryo suitability and eligibility report to their physician and embryologist so that the receiving clinic is approving the embryos before we're taking any steps forward.
That's very
that's really important because
down the road too.
Yeah, because we don't, we vet the embryos, but we really want the physician to give the green light that these are good embryos to accept.
We find that most matches are open with the ability to speak directly from recipient to donor. Or are they mostly anonymous, like you might see with egg or sperm donation?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. With embryo donation, we tend to find more of a spectrum, right? Because with egg donation, the egg donors are required basically to sign, either they want donor ID disclosure at 18 years old or closed, right? With embryo donation, these are people who are coming, giving a gift with children that are genetically related to these embryos. And so we have a spectrum of desires by both donors and recipients in terms of what their interests are. So they can be completely closed, or they can be what I call high engagement open. And high engagement open means that they're fostering a relationship among the adults before the children are old enough to make a decision. So it's akin to a long distance cousin, right? Because we're national, so we donate across the country. So you might not be in the same city. You could be in the same city if you want to be, but they're typically not. But you can know them from a very young age, so the kids can learn about these other people before they're asking and wondering where they came from.
Okay.
Most people probably fall somewhere in the middle. So it's a bit of a bell curve where a lot of people fall in that low engagement. They want to have a line of communication, but they're not fostering that. They're not doing play dates and having vacations together, right?
Right.
It's somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
So once we get that approval, we're going to ask the physician to approve. While we're getting physician approval, we ask everybody to go to an embryo donation counseling session. And this is really important. It's psychoeducational. It's intended to talk about how will you talk to your children about this, and when will you talk to them, both from the donor and the recipient side, right? Both families need to be having conversations with their children if they're going to be open, especially, but generally should be having conversations. So how do you have that conversation, and how do you refer to this other family? Those are things that are covered in that session. Making sure that you've really thought through everything, or even if you haven't completely thought through everything, that you're ready for those questions when you're ready for them.
Yeah, I find that many people don't necessarily initially see the value of the psych counseling, and at least in Florida, it's not a legal requirement, but it's absolutely a best practice established by the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And I find that every time after one of my clients does the psych counseling, they're so happy they did it. And it just enlightens them into so many different things that they might not have thought of before. So I think it's obviously an invaluable part of the process. I'm wondering, how does it work typically from what you see? Because it's not, at least here, it's not governed by state law. Is it individual sessions and then a joint session, kind of like a surrogacy evaluation? How does it logistically work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we ask that donors and intended parents each have individual sessions with their partner, if they have a partner, so that they can have their own private session with a counselor and talk about those issues. And agreed, a lot of people say, why am I going through this session at the beginning? Not everybody, but I think there's some hesitation. Most people do come out saying, I learned something, which is really what we want. And it is important to note that most people change their positions on some of the questions that come up during that counseling session after they've had a child, right? Because then they have a better sense of, it's not theoretical anymore. There's a real person there.
Sure.
We ask that if it's a known donation, so if it's a family member or somebody you met on Facebook and you come to us, or if it's a friend that donated embryos, we ask that those people do a joint session. And the reason for that is that they're coming in knowing each other already, and we want them to think about some of those harder questions, like if it is your friend or your sibling or somebody that you're close to that you've really thought through how you're going to engage long term. We don't ask it for other relationships. If they've matched through us,
okay.
We don't require that joint session unless it's required by the clinic.
Understood. Okay, very helpful.
Yeah.
So then what comes after medical approval, psychological approval, those things happen? What's the next step in the matching process?
Yes. Then there's Marla. Now it's time for legal.
All right.
So what we're going to do here is we're going to ask everybody to complete a legal intake. And so we're going to actually complete it for you. We're going to ask the donors and the intended parents to review it and make sure that they're comfortable with the language. There are really, it's mostly just facts. Here are the embryos you're receiving. Here's the clinic it's going to, basic things. There are two factors that we really want people to think about. One is interaction and two is disposition. As you know, interaction is not legally binding. We can't force families to have a relationship, but we do want to set some expectation before the legal agreement to say, these are our expectations or our hopes for how we choose to interact.
Okay.
The second is disposition, which is what happens with the remaining embryos. There may be remaining embryos after they've completed their family. And so we'll really want to get comfortable that both families know what happens to those embryos. That is legally binding in the sense that a clinic is going to look at that information to determine if they can complete the disposition that the recipient is asking for when they're ready.
So basically, if God forbid the intended parents die, get divorced, or like you said, are complete with their family, what happens to the embryos? Do they revert back to the donors? Do they then get destroyed? And it's super important to discuss this at the beginning so that it gets properly drafted into the agreement, and for the clinic to be aware of it as well.
Yes, yes, exactly. And to that point, it's important for the clinic to know it, and for everybody to just feel comfortable that this is the choice that they're making. Some donors might say, I just want you to redonate them. Or, you know what, I've completed, I don't feel comfortable with having more than 1 or 2 families out there, so I don't want them donated further. And some donors will say, these are my genetics, they're related to my kids. I really want to control where they go next. So when you're done, I want to redonate them as a donor.
Yeah, it's a very personal decision. I really think that varies from match to match. That needs to be tailored to each, specific match.
Yes, it absolutely does. And it's an important part of it. So, we want to make sure that people are comfortable from the beginning on what that disposition
But it's so helpful from a legal standpoint that Embryo Connections has this all laid out prior to getting to legal, because even though it might be simple types of decisions like how many and which embryos are being donated, without that legwork being done at the beginning, I find that on self matches, just knowing which embryos the parties are getting can create a huge headache, because they want the 2 girls and the 2 boys and this and that. So it's super helpful that your team kind of works. When I get the legal match sheet, I know exactly which embryos they're getting, what the disposition is, what the future contact will be, and it's all laid out in advance. So that's a really big benefit to working with your agency.
Yeah, and one thing I want to bring up too is that sometimes people have said, well, why don't I just use a template? Why don't we just use a legal template? And my answer to that is that the lawyers do really an important job. So you can probably talk a little bit more to that, but I feel like you are providing a lens that as an agency we don't see, or as we're representing both parties, first of all, and we're also not attorneys, so we don't know the state laws. We don't know the nuances.
Yes, you certainly wouldn't want to go through all this and jeopardize either party's parental rights or future, kind of interactions between the parties. So clearly it's a very state specific and tailored agreement that needs to be handled. And at least in Florida, again, we don't have laws regarding this best practice, but any matter that we work on together, Deb, and any embryo donation that I do, there are always separate attorneys, one for the intended parents, one for the embryo donor or donors, that are typically, both attorneys are paid for by the intended parents, and so the ones benefiting from the donation.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point too, because I think sometimes intended parents hear a donation and say, oh gosh, well, this should be free. There are a lot of costs that are associated with embryo donation. It costs a lot less than to do an egg donor cycle or to do an IVF cycle, frankly. It's one of the lowest cost alternatives in fertility besides maybe IUI. But there are costs associated with it, and the donors are not compensated. So we ask that the recipients pick up any expenses that are incurred due to the donation. So a lawyer is a great example of that.
Paying the shipping, as of what date are they paying for storage, things like that are all contemplated in the match sheet that you provide me, and goes into the legal agreement as well.
Yes, and I think the donors are grateful for being able to donate, and also grateful that it's not costing them money to do it, because they've already spent a lot on their own IVF journey.
So once legal's all finalized, the legal clearance sent to the clinic, the embryos are then typically shipped at that point to the transferring clinic, if not already there?
Yes, so we're going to work with the clinics to provide all the clearances that they need. We'll send them the correct embryo inventories and all the documents that they need to relabel the embryos to be in the intended parent's name. And then we'll coordinate the shipping from where they're stored to where they're going.
Okay.
We like to handle all of it because there are things that come up, and it's amazing the things that you don't think about. Like if a clinic has a cycle week, maybe they don't want to receive that week, or there's a document missing that they need from us. I think it's very helpful to have a professional party trying to handle that shipment.
Okay, great. So
Yeah.
what's next in the process? Just kind of the overall, like what goes into
Yeah.
the profile or?
Well, so the next step after that is they have babies.
Right.
So
Right.
then they get to have their transfers. And one thing about with Embryo Connections is that they get as many embryos, they get all those embryos up front. So if they get 2 or 3 embryos or 4, they're going to get all their embryos and then have their transfers as they need them. So, you know, maybe they have one child and they store the remaining embryos for when they want to have their second, or maybe they have their first transfer and it's not a success. They have the second embryo available for transfer right away.
Right. You're not redoing paperwork or shipping new embryos. You have enough for an attempt or two, hopefully.
Yes, yes, exactly. So the next thing we can go to is qualifications. What does it take to be a donor and an intended parent?
Right.
The donors, we ask that donors have at least two vitrified blasts in storage to donate. And that's important because not every embryo even survives the thaw. So if you want to donate, if you're a donor and you want to donate a single embryo, we can absolutely help with all the logistics. We just want a donor and intended parent to match before they come to Embryo Connections, because then they're taking on the risk of having only one embryo.
Right.
The second thing is we want their family to be complete. So this has really come from our counselors, that our counselors have told us how important this is, and we really respect that it's important to know that you're done before you start giving away embryos, just in case you change your mind and find yourself without embryos. And that can be sad for families. So we want to make sure that a donor is done, and that means that they've completed their pregnancy. So sometimes people want to donate while in the middle of their pregnancy, and we're willing to get started with them, but we really want them to have their baby before we
That's a good idea, for sure.
before we actually finalize the donation. And the last thing, of course, is that the legal owners are prepared to donate. And so we do work with divorcing families. And so we know that comes up during divorce, is okay, now it's time to do something with these remaining embryos. We're definitely happy as long as both parties are.
Right. The ownership can't be in a legal limbo to be donated. Even within my own agreement, we represent from the embryo donors that they have the legal ability to further donate these the embryos at hand. So
yes,
it's good that's a requirement.
Right. And so what's good for intended parents here is that we're making sure that all this is true, and we're getting the embryo inventory. We're making sure donors qualify before we share that profile with an intended parent. Okay. So that whatever an intended parent sees, they can feel confident would be an available set of embryos.
Does it matter whether the embryos are located in the United States or internationally? I know you mentioned shipping across borders.
Right, that's a great question. We can work outside of the United States, but typically we don't. Most of our embryos are within the United States, and we ship within the United States. Part of that is that the cost, it's pretty prohibitive to ship outside of the country. Okay. In addition, some of the guidelines require that the donors be in the United States for FDA eligibility, for example.
Understood. And I know I have heard of horror stories, none of my clients personally, but that customs can interfere with the actual shipping process and potentially destroy the embryos when they're en route.
Right, yes. Our shippers have told us that they feel very confident in shipping internationally, but there's definitely a little bit of a higher risk there because embryos can survive in that tank for about a week. That's about how long a tank will survive. It will hold its freeze.
Okay. And how do you qualify as an intended parent or intended parents for your program?
That's a great question. So one is to be an intended parent, to be seeking the embryos for your own use. The second is that you're medically prepared to transfer the embryos for yourself, or you're prepared to use a gestational carrier. Okay. And we don't ask that that an intended parent have already completed all of their exams with their physician before they come to us. But we do want to make sure that they're in that process so that they're getting their uterine evaluation so that they really feel, so that a physician feels confident. And part of that is we want to move really quickly. So as soon as we get a match, we want to send that embryo suitability and eligibility to the clinic, and the clinic will say yes. A physician will say yes if they've also already verified that the intended parent can receive.
Understood. Okay.
So it doesn't have to happen before talking to us, but it should be happening at least simultaneously.
Okay.
The next is a criminal background check, which we talked about. It's online. It's it's quick and easy. And the last one is that they have to be 52 or younger, or the carrier, and a combined age of 104 for a partnership.
Does that come from a certain guideline? It's certainly not like state specific, or is that just a best practice established?
Yeah, ASRM has best practices on who should be carrying pregnancies, and it's not based on the pregnancy itself. So I think a lot of intended parents say, I'm 54 and very healthy, and I can absolutely carry a pregnancy. But the question that ASRM asks is, will your child be without a parent by the time while they're still a minor? And that's a big concern for ASRM, and so we take on that guideline as our own.
Understood. Okay.
So what's in a profile? This is a question that comes up with donors and intended parents. What needs to be in a profile? What do I get to see? How do I make my choice? And the question is also, well, what criteria can I provide? Well, your criteria can be anything that's in a profile, right? If we can learn it in the profile, then you can include it as criteria. So what a donor will do is they're basically becoming egg donor and sperm donor. So we ask them to provide physical characteristics and education and hobbies and interests, what makes them tick. We also ask them to include pictures and open essays about themselves so that we can learn about who they are, and so that we can provide that to you. The other thing that's included there is extended family medical history, because that's really important, not only for choosing which embryos you want to receive, but also to hold on to for your children when you're going to physicians and you need to talk about what's in their background. And as they get older, to know, do they have heart conditions or high cholesterol, or whatever it is that they're prepared for that with that information.
And I find with most legal agreements, we do provide that the parties will use their best faith efforts to provide updates to one another of any newly learned medical information. I'm not sure if you find that with your matches as well.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really great point for why we see a lot of people at least have some form of communication, some line of communication.
Yeah, that's kind of the baseline. And then obviously, as you say, it grows from there as far as the communication that continues between everybody.
Yes, because it is really useful to have, even if it's through a third-party portal where you don't have contact information, to be able to say, hey, I'm curious about this condition, or somebody in my family just got this condition.
Of course.
So we also ask for recipient criteria and interaction preference. And those pictures, we always encourage them to include pictures, because every intended parent wants to know what their kids are going to look like.
Right.
Yeah, and donors usually want to share their adorable kids' pictures, so it's easy.
Great. I'm sure that's the fun part.
Yes. The intended parent profile is actually very similar to that. So that one includes almost everything except, it says extended family medical history. It doesn't include that. You'll include your own medical history a little bit, but we don't ask
relevant for that.
We don't ask for that. We do ask for donor criteria and interaction preference, because we're going to be matching on all those things. And as an aside, donors also love to see pictures of intended parents.
Oh, okay, great.
Because a picture tells 1,000 words.
Right. Yes. Especially in this day and age with social media, it's all about the pictures. And
yes, it is. So finding the match, we are always searching for donors. So we always have new donors coming in, and there is a match for everybody. So I think it's great. What we ask is that intended parents put their authentic self forward in their profile, and their authentic request forward, because we really want to find the right match. And that goes for both donors and recipients. I think people sometimes say, well, how long does it take, and how do I make it go faster? A couple of ways to make it go faster are to be flexible about what you're interested in. I think I can provide a really good example of, because I was coming in without embryo connections, right? I was doing this on my own. And when it came down to it, I said, I had one thing that was really important to me. And that was the one thing that I held on to. And I let go of everything else that I thought I might have wanted my kids to be.
Right.
Did I want them to look like me? No, I mean, that would have been fun, but was that really important? It wasn't important to me. So I figured out what was important. Everybody has different things that are important to them. Some people really want their kids to look like them, and that's great. That should be their thing. The more criteria that you put on your donation,
right,
the longer it takes to donate.
For sure. I've seen it very niche into specific religions and things like that, which I always, from what I see from my clients, it obviously can add to the time for it to be that very specific match.
Yes. And I'll add, I do want people to put in criteria that are important to them, because if they're important, we'll find the right match. And sometimes what's important is already in our database. So that particularly is true when it's an open interaction, right? If it's values that are important because you want to be connected, you want to feel connected to the other family, we want to make sure that happens. So we ask that they do must-haves and nice-to-haves, because it's much easier if we know what that split is.
Right.
And we talked about this already, but alert your clinic. If a clinic doesn't accept embryos, that's okay. We'll find another clinic that will accept embryos.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point to raise. You don't want to, many people are very committed to their clinic, as they should, but if sometimes you just they can't accept them.
Yeah, some can't accept them. And I will also say that many clinics won't accept them because they haven't worked with embryo connections yet. And once they work with embryo connections, they're much more comfortable because we're doing the FDA eligibility, the site clearance, the legal clearance. We're getting everything they need to all the medical records they need to make the decision. So they're much more likely.
Analogous to like the egg donation process, that's just very streamlined and more routine. You now created this whole infrastructure to make it, to simplify it for the clinics, whereas before it might have just been chaotic.
Yeah. Yes. I would say clinics very much shy away from donations that are done by themselves, that a patient tries to do themselves, because there's so much legwork involved. So I would not, if your clinic says no, if a recipient's clinic says no, I always say, let us give them a call and see if they'll still say no.
Great.
They might say yes. And then to schedule any surgeries or anything that any required exams that needs to happen before the transfer, because we'd hate for you to wait to transfer just because you didn't parallel path. So,
right.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty simple to me, right? All in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are obviously important steps in the whole process that need to be followed to make it be the perfect fit.
Yes. Yes. And now we're here in your area. This is really your space. A couple of things that are true for embryo connections is that, and I think all donations, is that a donating family does not receive compensation for their embryos.
Correct.
That's important for everybody to know, because it is human tissue.
It is not baby selling. They do not receive any net profit from the process. As you said, it's essentially a gift. Only out-of-pocket expenses are reimbursable.
Yes. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the legal agreement, because you certainly know it better than I do.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I love how you have on your slide just as simple as that it should be in a reproductive attorney, because I can't tell you how many times a potential client wants me to work on it with their family's real estate attorney or whoever, and that's just a total nightmare because you don't want to dabble in this area. It's very specific and you don't want to mess it up for the parties. So, as I said a few times, it's all state specific. So, Embryo Connections will ensure that the parties have attorney recommendations in the appropriate state. And we can do a whole webinar on which state law applies. So
Yes.
for another time, but you'll have to consult with an attorney to ensure that what state law can apply to the donation. But generally speaking, as you said, once there's medical approval and psych approval, the intended parent's attorney generally is the one that drafts the agreement, and the embryo donors have an attorney paid for them or for the donor to review the agreement with the embryo donor or donors. And with the match information we receive from Embryo Connections, the terms are generally all fleshed out. The agreement will address all the things that were previously discussed by the parties. How many embryos, which embryos, we identify them by number, how long sometimes there's limitations on how long the intended parents can essentially use the embryos, the time period, that's not always included. The disposition, I mean, everything we've talked about on this seminar, the disposition of the embryos, what happens to them when the recipient's done with their family, what happens in death or divorce, can they be further donated? The agreement will get into confidentiality. So even though there might be a level of open communication, it's still a highly confidential agreement. And so the contract will address, can this be shared with the world or on social media, which many times is not, unless the parties agree otherwise. So, I mean, the agreement goes into a bunch of different things that are really critical to be discussed at length, in your consultation with your separate attorney. And once the agreement—
one thing that I think comes up that would be great to talk about is parentage. So does this agreement specify parentage or what is required?
Yeah, so in Florida, when the intended parent receives these embryos, the use of them, as long as they're using them themselves, that child is their legal child. I mean, they're having the baby as if it was their own genetics. So where it gets a little bit more complicated, but still extremely possible, is when they're involving a third party with a surrogate. So, the embryo donation agreement will many times say that the intended parents can use it for themselves or with a surrogate. And then parentage for the intended parents when you use a surrogate involves a separate consultation with how do you become a legal parent of a child born via surrogacy. It gets a little more complicated because not all states will allow a donor embryo for certain situations. It might be more complicated, for example, for a same-sex couple, married or not, to use a donor embryo, where it might then actually involve some form of an adoption process for the intended parents to actually be the legal parents of that child. I can only speak as to Florida. If you're working with a surrogate, anybody can work with a gestational surrogate in Florida with a donor embryo. So you can be single, married, not married, and the use of a donor embryo will not compromise your ability to be the legal parent of that child once born. Now, mind you, there are some court proceedings involved and a separate surrogacy contract you'll need to do, but it's possible, and it's very much legal in Florida.
So another question that I know comes up is, what are the concerns or things that they should be looking for in the agreement? What are the hot topics as you're reviewing an agreement with a donor or a recipient that they should make sure are included?
Yeah, I mean, beyond just the basics, how many embryos are you getting? Which ones are we getting? It really goes back to the principles we've been talking about in this seminar. Is what's the disposition of the embryos? What essentially permission are the donors giving to the recipients on what can be done with these embryos when they're done or after unforeseen circumstances? Because that seems like a simple enough topic, but everybody has such different positions on what can happen with the embryos. And also, I would say the biggest hot topic item is just what the communication is going to be between the donors and the recipients, not just during the donation process, but clearly after the fact, and what kind of communication do they want to have. So to the extent that all can be kind of worked out as much as possible before it gets to legal is immensely helpful. But it's certainly something that gets further analyzed in the legal agreement. So that, to me, those two things are really some of the biggest hot ticket items I see in the legal agreement.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. One thing that we like to stress with all of our clients is that the legal agreement is in fact that, a legal agreement, and it doesn't established exactly what you would do in terms of interaction or relationship long term. So we always encourage people to choose the lowest common denominator. So that you not put a lot of specificity in terms of how you're planning on interacting, because first of all, you don't know, you're bound to change your mind, or have a new perspective, rather, maybe not change your mind, but have a new perspective as you have children. And so keeping that as loose as possible, I think, is the safest in a legal agreement.
There's a wonderful Florida psychologist down here that says you want to leave the door open at least. You don't want to close the door, because once it's closed, it's hard to reopen. So,
yes.
But again, you don't, like you said, you don't want to get too specific, like agreeing to monthly updates or something too, because then you don't want to have an inadvertent breach of a legal agreement either.
Right.
So, a general meeting of the minds where, the parties understand what their communication is going to be. I mean, and as you mentioned at one point in this discussion, the recipients are the legal parents of this child. So the donors do not have legal rights. They're non-parents. They don't have rights to the child. So future communication truly is a best wish between the parties. It's unclear, at least in Florida, if you could even truly enforce the agreement to allow someone to continue communicating, because as a non-parent has no rights. So it really is hopefully, the best interest of the parties to continue that communication if that's something that they want to do, and that they use their best efforts to continue with that, because it's not something necessarily you could file a lawsuit over.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really great question, just to confirm, because I think people ask about the risks, like, what is the risk as an intended parent? And I think you just clarified there's not a risk like traditional adoption where a donor can take back a child.
Right. Your parentage rights are protected, and making sure you follow all the right steps to ensure that. But your future communication, I mean, who's to say that someone just doesn't fall off the face of the earth? I mean, you can't really enforce it like you could like a purchase and sale agreement, where it's like a very clear thing. You're as a non-parent, your rights are, it's really more of like a best efforts kind of efforts between everybody.
And so on the donor side, we sometimes hear about their fears, like, what are, their risks for a child coming to them saying, you're my parent, or you owe child support. What are their risks?
I mean, we say that probably 20 different ways in the agreement, that there are no child support obligations, you're a non-parent, no responsibilities, and the recipients are the ones assuming all rights. So provided everything's handled in the appropriate legal way, I can only speak to Florida, is very clear. You have no parental rights. The donors have no parental rights to the child born, as long as they're with ownership of the intended parents. Now, mind you, there are certain circumstances where the donors revert back to the embryo donors, maybe after a certain period of time, or when the intended parents are complete with their family. And in that case, we do clarify the reverse, that the donors will then be responsible for any parental rights if the embryos revert back to them, and that the recipients no longer have responsibility for those embryos because they're no longer there. So we have to make it clear, kind of both ways too.
Right. So just to get back on maybe a more positive note, is that the legal agreement is intended it's a contract which gives parents the full right to have their children and be the parents that they want to be. So it's a process that we have to go through, because we want to make sure that everybody has their legal rights and there aren't any questions down the road. So that's why we do it. But the intent in the end is to have children. So there's a really great gift that comes at the end of that.
Yes, and it's a friendly process. It's not like what you might imagine, like a Law and Order divorce proceeding or whatever. It's very amicable. Everyone's like in it to work together. Even the attorneys are, hopefully trying to all work together and make a very smooth process. So it's collaborative.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because people, I think intended parents often fear that a donor will want to co-parent, or will want to, have those weekly calls or monthly updates like it was a traditional adoption. The truth is most donors are giving because they've completed their family and they don't want more children, and they really consider it a gift that they can give the embryos to somebody who can use them and be wonderful parents.
Yeah.
So they do feel like it is a gift. They also feel connected to those embryos in a certain way. They feel responsible for them to make sure that they go to a good family, and they feel connected in that they're genetically related to their children, but they recognize the difference. That's one of the reasons we go through counseling, is so that they recognize that they aren't parents of those children.
I think it's a very common concern, but one that can quickly be kind of alleviated with the proper counseling and everything else. Same thing, no different from surrogacy. There's fears that, will the surrogate get connected to the baby? But everyone gets back to their life. Hopefully everybody has their own kids, and, it's a beautiful thing, and everybody kind of lives their lives with whatever communication they've agreed to.
Yes. Which gets us to the next thing, which is physical relocation. So embryo connections, we talked a little bit about this, is going to ensure that everybody has the right paperwork, and that we work with the right transporter to ship them. And, different, based on where they're stored and where they're going, we might use different transporters, but we're going to use the ones that we feel really confident are going to get the embryos to their destination safely.
I know that when I shipped my embryos many years ago, there was something called Embryo, like in shipping insurance. Is that something that's still an option and something you recommend?
Absolutely. So we depending on where we're shipping and to and from, we'll work with the one of the most well-known shippers, which is Cryoport, and we include insurance. We include the insurance in that in their fee for transport. So we get a discount with them because we're working on a corporate scale. So they get both, an intended parent will get both the discount and they'll get the insurance, which is, it covers up to $25,000. So that's the amount that's paid out if something were to happen, depending on the number of embryos that are damaged during transport. Okay. We've never had a situation where embryos were damaged during transport.
Good to know. Good to know.
Yeah. Yes. But it's nice to have the insurance just in case.
Right, exactly. I mean, no money would ever really make up for what was lost, but it certainly can get somebody back on their feet.
But it helps if you have the money so that you can do it again if you absolutely have to. Yeah. So last is, how long does it take? It start to finish, it's about 4 to 12 months. And there are a lot of reasons why that timeline is so long.
When you say 4 to 12 months, how long does it take is this the matching to legal, from what to what?
Yeah, so it might take us, say, getting started, that could take a week or two, meeting with us, getting the profile submitted. Once the profile is submitted, that's when we're ready to match. And so that might take us 3 to 7 months to find the right family. So many it might happen right away. So it could be 2 weeks. I've made some matches within a week. And then sometimes it takes,
and the right fit, it will happen when it's meant to happen too.
Right. And so what I tell people is that I know it feels people I think get really anxious. Our intended parents get anxious around 3 to 4 months, where they say, gosh, I've been waiting and I just want to find the embryos for us. And my answer is, I really want to find the right match. And if that takes an extra 2 weeks, I want to wait that extra 2 weeks or wait that extra month, because this is a lifetime decision that we really want to make sure that it's a good fit.
Right.
And sometimes if you have tough criteria, loosening those criteria can make it easier to find a match. And then it takes about 3 to 5 weeks to get the clearances. So we need the clinic to say yes. We need to get the counseling done. So that can take about a month to get through that. And then we have to do legal. So that takes some time. I like to say it takes about 6 weeks to ensure that we get through everything, get the legal intake done, get it, the draft and reviewed. Often they have to sign in front of a notary, so we want to leave room for that. And knowing that people take vacations, and
of course, there's time.
Families with children who are donating are busy, so so we like to leave room. And then it takes them about two to 3 weeks to ship. I say 3 weeks to be safe for those reasons, like a clinic might not be able to ship the week we want to ship.
Right.
So
make the babies.
And then make the babies. We ask that
it's an
people,
embryo, so it's like it's ready to go.
Yeah, we ask that people plan their cycle for at least 3 weeks after the embryos arrive at the clinic. So you can be planning for your transfer date, but the best thing to do is wait until you're in the legal agreement to pick out that date. And then you want to pick out that date probably 3 months after you've started legal, because that's about how long it'll take to finish legal and get those embryos shipped.
Right.
But you still have 3 weeks after they've arrived to have your transfer.
An exciting time, I'm sure, when you're at that point, getting, your cycle ready to go.
Yes, it is. Everybody's very eager.
Yeah.
So we're happy to work as fast as we can.
What you offer is incredible. I mean, I really don't know anyone else that offers such an amazing service to intended parents and the service to donors that gives them an option to allow their embryos to be used for this incredible purpose. And I'm always so happy to, send people your way to help them out, because it's a great need for what you do with Embryo Connections and helping people donate their embryos.
Well, thank you, Marla. We love what we do. Everybody at Embryo Connections is in it for the happy families. We love to help people have their children. I'm personally dedicated to it because it means so much to me that I was able to have kids through my donor.
Yeah, so, no, I mean, everyone, many people come to this whole third-party reproductive world based upon your personal experience. You worked, with an embryo donor. I worked with a surrogate to have my kids.
Right.
And if you're able to help contribute your own personal experiences into what we do, it's a beautiful thing all around. And I, know from my own clients that have worked with embryo donations, Embryo Connections, I'm sorry, they're just so happy to have this option, and it's incredible, really. So thank you so much for your time today and for all this wonderful information. I know it'll be so helpful to people interested in embryo donation. And I just thank you so much. And it's great working with you.
Thank you, Marla. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, so everyone's information is on this slide. Feel free to reach out to me, and I speak on behalf of Deb. You can reach out to her and her team directly as well through this information. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.